Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And we have certainly turned a major corner in our return for college football. We've reached game week here for week 0, which means we'll talk a little bit today about what's going to happen this upcoming Saturday with Georgia's rival, Georgia Tech, in Ireland to take on Florida State, a team that Georgia embarrassed the last time it played a football game back in January. But the game you care about perhaps the most here right now, though, is what Georgia's going to do 2 Saturdays from now against the Clemson Tigers. And the good news is it is not too soon to start talking very seriously about that game. So today we will do that. We sort of perceive that Georgia's set to begin its preparations for Clemson. And we're going to talk on the program today to kick things off about the one, at least perceived, advantage that Georgia needs to exploit in this game on Saturday, 2 Saturdays from now, against the Clemson Tigers. So we'll do that. We'll give you a little bit of intel we think we've been able to unearth about the scrimmage that Georgia participated in on Saturday. We've got a couple of interesting recruiting notes for you. And Jon Stinchcomb joins the program there as well. So you can tell, to kick off a week here, we are all the way locked and loaded and ready to go for a very fun college football season. We're also glad to have you with us for it as we do. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We have reached that moment. It is time now to start talking about what's going to happen for Georgia a couple of Saturdays from now against Clemson. Now, that's not the only thing on today's program. We got recruiting stuff for you. We got some intel from the scrimmage. We got a lot of things like that, plus Jon Stinchcomb as well. But I want to begin with kind of some early thoughts here on an incredible showdown that Georgia has to begin the 2024 season. And also kind of a reminder that, and I was talking to some folks about this the other day, that when you think about the excitement that exists for this year, this 2024 season we're about to kind of travel our way through, clearly some of that's related to the chance at another national championship and all of that. But just sort of the base level excitement, I think, that exists around Georgia football right now is largely related to the fact that week to week, I don't know that we've ever seen a schedule that's more interesting on paper than the one that Georgia's about to play. Now, obviously, some of that's the challenge of trying to win some of these games. And if you're a Georgia coach or player, obviously that's a pretty daunting task. But for those of us who are entertained by all of this, there's never been more opportunity for entertainment than the schedule that Georgia's about to go through, starting with that season opener against Clemson. So let's do sort of a basic level comparison of Georgia and Clemson at the moment. One of the things that we know is that Clemson as a program, from where it was when these two teams last played in 2021, or kind of where Clemson was during that stretch where they make the playoffs every year from 2015 through 2020, winning 2 national championships in that span. One of the things we know is that Clemson as a program, and this is just a fact, they have regressed since then. How much have they regressed? Well, we'll still find out, I guess, coming up in a couple of weeks. They're obviously still remain, in the preseason top 25, so they're still among the better teams in the country, but they are not what they once were. And when you kind of dive a little deeper into all of that, what you realize is that if you look just on the defensive side of the ball for a moment, there's still a degree to which Clemson sort of feels like Clemson. Guys like Barrett Carter, for instance, big-time playmaker. Clemson is still among the better overall defenses that Georgia probably will play in this regular season. And if there's anything about Clemson that would kind of still resemble something of like sort of the national elite status, maybe what the Tigers are able to do defensively might be an example of that. But when you flip to the other side of the ball, that's where the contrast between these two teams, at least on paper, would appear to become pretty stark, because Clemson is not offensively what it was in the best of the Trevor Lawrence years and the best of the Deshaun Watson years, the collection of playmakers kind of around, Clemson, around quarterback, and that's Cade Klunbinik this year. They're not seemingly what they once were. This is just a Clemson team that has a harder time scoring points than it used to, and that's obviously cost Clemson some football games in recent seasons. Georgia, on the other hand, one of just two teams in America to average 40 points per game in each of the last two seasons, joining USC that's had a Heisman Trophy winner and all that kind of stuff. That has been what Georgia has been offensively. So it certainly seems like on paper the difference between Georgia and Clemson could not be more stark when it comes to the offensive side of the ball. And so just very, very simply, I would say, looking at this game, trying to keep things as simple as possible, when Georgia gets ready to take on Clemson coming up in a couple of Saturdays, if Georgia wants to ensure its chances of winning and if it wants to have the kind of comfortable win that the odds makers are suggesting is a likelihood for Georgia at the moment, exploiting that advantage on offense, truly being the better offense in the game, is sort of the simplest way to make sure that happens. And it's not lost on me that when Georgia played Oregon in this same game, in this same building 2 seasons ago, that's exactly what Georgia did in a conversation about how much they lost off their 2021 national championship team and all of that. Georgia started that game against a good Oregon team by scoring touchdowns on 7 consecutive drives, built a 49-0 lead, ended up winning the game 49-3. But that kind of preseason kickoff game in Atlanta was a showcase that day for the Georgia offense. And on just the simplest level of evaluation, if Georgia is to beat Clemson in a couple of Saturdays, and if it is to win comfortably again like it did in that game against the Ducks going back a couple of seasons ago, being the better offensive team is obviously a major part of that potential story. But here's where things, I think, get a little interesting with this. While on paper, Georgia's the much better offensive team than Clemson, Clemson is certainly spending its preseason and its fall camp in the hopes of actually being better offensively this upcoming year than it has been previously. And Cade Klunbinik, who I mentioned a moment ago, the Clemson quarterback, recently spoke about a couple of reasons why he thinks this offense this season can be better. And obviously this is more important for Georgia fans as they get ready to take on Clemson here. Let me read this to you from On 3. Clemson quarterback Cade Klunbinik talking about what he's hoping for from his offense and why he thinks there's a chance at improvement here this year. Klubnik saying, we've just had a really good mindset more than anything. We were a really young team last year, and this is a team that's just a lot smarter in offense now. For me personally, just having a year under my belt, we're just a smarter football team. Klubnik, the Clemson quarterback, goes on to say, guys have got a little bit more experience kind of all over. When it comes to receivers, offensive line, quarterback, running back, just a lot of guys that have played a lot of ball now and just returning starters. Let me pause on that for a moment. I'll read the rest of the quotes in just a second. So if you care about like some of the ESPN analytics stuff, like returning production and things like that, that's kind of become the more modern way to look at what a team brings back. It used to be we talked about returning starters, but the definition of a starter can be a little bit of a loaded phrase that sort of means different things to different teams sometimes. But returning production is a little easier to understand. When you look at your stats from a year ago, the percentage of players who contributed to those stats who come back here this season, that's a little bit easier to understand. And according to a lot of those advanced stat, number cruncher, bean counter types from ESPN, we're told that Clemson brings back about 79% of its offensive production a year ago here for 2024. That's not an insignificant number in Clemson's hopes to be better on that side of the ball than it has been in recent seasons. Beyond that, Klubnik also gave you another reason for optimism as you're a Clemson fan. If I'll show that graphic on the screen one more time, I'll read the rest of that quote. Klubnik also says that's one of the biggest things. Getting to come back in the same offense again is huge. Not having to have your first fall camp in a new offense like you would have a year ago and getting to run things that you've already been running. It is huge. So that's Klubnik saying, we got guys coming back, and we're playing in the same offense. And I'll remind you here that a year ago when Garrett Riley was hired by Clemson, that was viewed as a pretty big deal. Riley was obviously the brother of Lincoln Riley, the USC coach. He had been offensive coordinator at TCU. Clemson hiring him was thought to be a pretty significant coup. And yet Riley did not have a huge impact at all on the 2023 season. But sometimes we see offensive coordinators a little better in year 2 than they were in year 1. We may have even an example or two of that around the Georgia program if you want to go back in recent history. And so there are some Clemson fans who believe that Riley, in his second season as offensive coordinator, bringing back a lot of the same talent that Clemson had a year ago, more experience, more comfort, more at ease in the offense overall. Maybe Clemson is just better on that side of the ball. But then there's also the flip side of this about what's going on for Georgia right now. And while Georgia statistically has been the much better unit in comparison to these two offenses, there is also a major question around the Georgia program here at the moment, which is, can they still put up the same kind of numbers that Georgia has in the last, let's say, 3 seasons, full season since the pandemic? Can Georgia put up the same kind of offensive numbers as it gets ready to play for the very first time without Brock Bowers? Because those 40-plus point per game performances I was talking about a moment ago, all of those came with a historic figure like Bowers as a part of the offense. And when Georgia broke through in a major way in 2021 to win its first national championship in the Kirby Smart era, once again, Brock Bowers was also doing a lot of things for the Georgia offense to make that group look more, successful than maybe it otherwise would have looked. Is Georgia ready for life after Bowers? I will tell you this, speaking of ESPN, when it comes to their early preview of Georgia against Clemson on the pages of ESPN.com, they were also zeroing in on this as a major talking point for this game. In fact, I'll read this to you from Mark Schlabach, who says, the Bulldogs' season opener against the Tigers at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta will provide the first look at a revamped passing game that lost star tight end Brock Bowers and receivers Ladd McConkey and Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint. But the truth is, McConkey was hurt a lot of last year, and Rosemy-Jacksaint, while a very good player, his statistical contribution nowhere near as large as Bowers, but nonetheless, they are still missing pieces from last year's offense. Schlabach goes on to write, quarterback Carson Beck will play behind one of the best offensive lines in the country, but Dominic Lovett, Dylan Bell, Arian Smith, and others will be asked to step up on the perimeter. How quickly, Schlabach asks, can Beck develop in-game chemistry with these new pass catchers against what should be another salty Clemson defense? So there you have it from Mark Schlabach, kind of laying out what I think is the major storyline for Georgia-Clemson ahead of the game 2 Saturdays from now. That on paper, it certainly appears that Georgia has the better offense than Clemson. That's what the recent track record of the sport will tell you. But for Georgia, it's a now new-look offense because it no longer has Brock Bowers. And you're trying to cultivate the same level of firepower with a different collection of playmakers around the quarterback. And by the way, it's not just Schlabach who's talking about that. Kirby Smart himself was also talking about that last week, that as Carson Beck settles in for an incredibly pivotal season for him, for his present tense performance at Georgia and his future tense look at what he might be in the 2025 NFL draft or individual accolades that could come his way. As Beck is readying himself for all of that, Kirby talked a little bit like what Schlabach just wrote about, the comfort that he has with those new playmakers around him and how quickly and easily they can all get settled in. This is what Smart said about that topic last week.
There's a good nucleus of 11 guys who've played a lot of football when you count Arian, Dylan, Oscar, Dom, and those guys. But there's not the depth around Carson at the skill positions that there's been in the past. And, it puts more pressure on him to probably feel like he's got to be perfect, to feel like he's got to make the right decision, the protection check, do this. And can I count on that guy that hadn't done it yet to do the right thing and trust that he's going to do it even though he may be a freshman? Those are things that Carson's, he's got to get familiar with those other guys.
So I think it's interesting that Smart used the word pressure to describe the way that Beck perhaps feels as he gets ready to kind of quickly acclimate himself to the new receivers, pass catchers around him. And what I'll tell you is there's an element to which this pressure for a quarterback at a place like Georgia is probably just unavoidable. Of course you're going to feel that. Of course you have a huge spotlight on you, especially in this NIL age where we're hearing about Beck and his private jet endorsements and his Lamborghinis that he drives, and he's dating, what's-her-face from Miami, and all of the stuff that we've kind of heard about, Carson Beck only enhances the sense of pressure that he has to now go and on the field live up to all of the attention that he seemingly has been getting during the offseason, and I don't think you can avoid that. And, to kind of add to that, this is a spot, the one that Georgia's about to be in against Clemson, where we've seen the Dogs essentially be dominant in recent years. I've mentioned this on Friday. Ever since Georgia's close, sort of squeak by, nail-biting win against Clemson to begin the 2021 season, When Georgia's played those type of games, non-conference games against ranked opponents, other than the Peach Bowl game against Ohio State, they've all been dominant blowout wins. Think about Michigan in the Orange Bowl. Think about, as I mentioned, Oregon to kick off the 2022 season, a national championship against TCU, the Orange Bowl last year against Florida State. These non-conference matchups, whether they're in season or postseason, against these ranked, non-conference opponents, other than the thrilling win for Georgia against Ohio State, everything else has been an absolute dominant blowout, an easy, comfortable win with an eye-popping score. Is Georgia ready to do that again against Clemson here right now? Any chance that requires them being the better offensive team against the Clemson offense, the things that will be improved this year compared it was to a season ago. And if Georgia does take those strides of improvement on its own and also kind of reintroduces itself in a post-Brock Bowers world, then a lot of that is going to fall on quarterback Carson Beck's shoulders. How well can he cultivate Dylan Bell and Dominic Lovett and the new crop of guys who are ready to lead the way for the Georgia offense? It's one of the most fascinating storylines ahead of next Saturday's game against Clemson. And how well Georgia exploits its perceived offensive advantage is going to be a big, big pathway for victory in this game against the Tigers. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We are happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us, whether it's video, radio, and Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, Apple, Spotify, all those platforms. Just so happy to have you as a part of the program today, and genuinely, sincerely thankful to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia who make it all possible for you there as well. You don't think much about your windows unless you need new windows, but on a daily basis, those windows are doing a lot of work for you. They're making your home look better on the outside. They're also making your home feel better on the inside. And if you haven't upgraded your windows in a long time, I think you're probably not aware of just how much better the product is overall now, and how superior the product is in particular from Pella Windows and Door of Georgia. It used to be that, kind of hard to open or certainly hard to clean, but now the way in which the product is installed, that ability to kind of, take them down or move them out and wipe them down and, make sure they're sealed properly. There has just been so much improvement in that space in recent years, and no one has led the way in that improvement more so than our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia. So if you're ready for your home to feel as good as it can on the inside, not that sort of still, stale air that comes from a home where just things aren't flowing as well as they could, or if you're ready for your home to look as good as it can on the outside, to be a great neighbor and to kind of protect your resale value and just give yourself the best possible curb appeal, it's time to have a conversation with one of those Pella experts about that, or a brand new door, because obviously we know what that can do to kind of impact your resale value and things like that. It's time to have a conversation with one of those Pella experts. You can stop by and see them in their Experience Center in Duluth, which is a really cool spot to be at. You can invite them to come to your home for what is truly a no-pressure consultation. They're not going to try to push you towards something or, kind of coerce you into making a decision. They want to educate you because they believe once you know why Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best, then you'll make the right decision, which is to install Pella windows and a Pella door right there in your home. That's what it's all about. Also, great savings between now and the end of the month, August 31st. You can get 10% off Pella projects or no interest if paid in full within 18 months. So really, really good savings there on all of that. So talk through the installation options. They'll give you a free quote. They'll answer whatever questions you might have. Reach out to them online. You can give them a call at 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429, or find them online, pellaofga.com/DawgNation. That's pellaofga.com/DawgNation for a lot more on that today. All right, we got Jon Stinchcomb here coming up in a moment. That's going to be a great conversation. Always love Jon on a Monday. Also, before we're done today, a couple of interesting recruiting notes as it relates to the Georgia Bulldogs. We'll cover some of that here, too. But prior to that, let's go around the doghouse here today, poured by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And I was obviously very busy this weekend. We were doing high school football, our Corky Kell Dave Hunter Classic, but I'm like the rest of you. I'm on my phone and trying to find out what I can learn and who may have been at that scrimmage on Saturday, and are they sharing any of the details. It seems like overall, I don't know, because a lot of the people who were there on Saturday were the lettermen former letterman to the program. It seems like overall there's probably a little less information that came out of this scrimmage than the previous scrimmage. And when you get the boosters there, the boosters, and I love the boosters, but they are a little bit more loose-lipped. They're a lot more likely to talk. They'll tell you more about whatever, and you have to sort of sift through the various eyewitness accounts to sort of figure out what's what. I'd say there's a little bit more of a streamlined level of information coming out of the second Georgia scrimmage, but that doesn't stop some information from coming out. I was getting text messages on Saturday, for instance, that supposedly Georgia running back Nate Frazier had another very interesting scrimmage. I was told that he had kind of a long touchdown run. And listen, we try to be pretty self-aware around here. Obviously, we are contributing to a lot of hype around a player that has not played his first Georgia game yet. And that's not always a very safe place to be, because when you build up something too much, you always run the risk of being disappointed. When you're building up something you haven't seen, hey, did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? So, by the time we actually get to the season, the telephone game here kind of has Frazier as Herschel Walker before he even plays his first game. And there's obviously some risks around building this up a little too much, so much so that when I was getting the text messages about, whatever, I was a little bit tempted to not even mention it, because it's like at this point in time, okay, we get it. Nate Frazier's had a nice summer. Nate Frazier's doing whatever. That's kind of confirmed. That is, the thing the smart guys always say, as expected. As expected, Nate Frazier had a nice scrimmage for Georgia there on Saturday. So I wasn't going to really say anything about it. But we do, I believe, have some actual photographic evidence, or at least some video evidence, to confirm some of what some folks were saying they had seen at the scrimmage there on Saturday. Georgia does a nice little thing of it. I love this because it gets the internet sleuths involved, including, I guess, me in this particular case, where Georgia will put out the video. They got like 1,000 edits. It's very hard to sort of tell what's what. But there's always a good number of Georgia fans on social media, and I love these fans for this. A good number of Georgia fans on social media who are trying to slow it down, kind of frame by frame, Zapruder style, to sort of, I saw this and I saw that. And one of the things, at least I think we can say we saw from this video that Georgia put out post-scrimmage on Saturday, was a little bit of a confirmation of at least something as it relates to Nate Frazier. Now, unlike some, I don't just steal Georgia's videos and get cheap views from them. So let me put this screenshot up here for you. The picture here of the full video of what appears to be a long run for Nate Frazier from Saturday's scrimmage. Some folks who were there were saying that had happened. And this screenshot of the video that Georgia had put out on social media would seem to be a confirmation of that Frazier apparently did have another long run on Saturday and perhaps another impressive scrimmage performance. So as we get ready for the upcoming season, interesting to sort of imagine what Nate Frazier's role in all of this could be, and at the risk of kind of making it too much and getting the hype train kind of running away before the season begins. Indeed, a lot of fun there on that. So Georgia has another scrimmage, and now on the other side of that, kind of getting ready for those preparations against Clemson. And we'll see how big of a role Frazier plays in that game against the Tigers coming up in a couple of weeks. It certainly should be a lot of fun. And that is Around the Doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. Now, speaking of a lot of fun here, too, Dr. Pepper has unveiled its new Fansville commercial for 2024. You got Quinn Ewers there as a part of that. Also, some of those. And listen, it's the only national campaign I've probably never gotten tired of, because, they just, real college football fans are clearly writing these scripts. I think they've got some stuff about sign stealing and things like that in there this year. So they're clearly having some fun with the major topics and the hot topics from college football from the previous year. But as we get ready for the fall and Fansville and the return of all that with Dr. Pepper, there is still some time left to enjoy the great taste of summer there, too. Of course, I'm talking about the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut and the Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar. You're enjoying those last days of pool time before the season gets here, or out on your back deck, the patio, whatever you got there with that. Well, if you want the greatest taste that summer can provide, It's Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut and Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar. So as you're out there doing your shopping at your local Kroger or wherever you're doing all of that, our friends from Dr. Pepper got you covered on the taste of summer. Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut, Dr. Pepper Creamy Coconut Zero Sugar. Make sure you try all of that today. All right, let me I was going to do a thing for the DawgNation Invasion. I actually forgot to do that. Let me push that off here for a couple of minutes. I'll do that in a few minutes, reminding you about the fun stuff we have going down for DawgNation Invasion. So we'll get to that here coming up in just a minute. For now, though, want to get into everything going on around Georgia football, including those early thoughts about Georgia against Clemson that are not quite so early anymore now that we're just a couple of weeks away from that big game. So let's do all of that as we get ready to welcome on the former All-American Jon Stinchcomb here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Glad to have all of you with us as well.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We will say hello to Jon Stinchcomb, the great former Georgia All-American, who's been a busy guy here over the course of the last few weeks, obviously always keeping his eye on Georgia football. But this is that time of year when Jon kind of puts his gold and black back on again. Were you doing a Saints preseason football this weekend, Jon?
I was actually scouting for them. I mean, their game against the 49ers got picked up nationally. So Mark Sanchez and Tom Brady was in the house for that one.
Well, there you go. Always a lot of fun there on that. And obviously Georgia had its own version of fun here this past weekend there too, when they held their second scrimmage, kind of that, like, I guess we sort of think of this as the unofficial end to fall camp, and now Georgia sort of begins its work for Clemson. We'll talk more about that game here in a moment, but I was kind of half serious, half joking about a player that I believe you and I also talked about last week, was the freshman running back Nate Frazier, and the fact that at different moments here this summer, for those who've been there to see it, there has been a lot of buzz around him. And you know, I'm careful not to sort of make more of it than it needs to be because, you know, sometimes these things end up being false positives, and nobody needs the sort of hype machine that the big, you know, sort of media machine around Georgia can sometimes create here. But what do you make about the fact that, you know, thus far the stuff around Frazier just does not seem to be slowing down very much?
Yeah, there's legitimacy here. I think he has flashed and continued to show that he's got that capability. He's one of the quickest backs in that room, and we've seen that burst throughout camp. It's caught a lot of people's attention, and he's garnered the buzz based on performance. And that's with a room full of guys that there's a lot of excitement. I'm still excited to see Etienne. I'm excited to see Robinson back healthy, and the other Robinson be able to pound it. But what Nate Frazier brings is that burst. And it's similar to what Etienne brings, is that they've got that extra gear that when they hit the hole, it's a challenge. It makes every secondary player, they better have the right angle, because if you don't, he can run right past you.
Yeah, interesting kind of an irony that for a long time it's been Branson Robinson who we're talking about dealing with injury, and now there's a little bit of chatter that Roderick Robinson might be a little banged up. We'll get more confirmation from Kirby Smart on that, you know, perhaps coming up this week. But in a minute, I want to talk to you about kind of, you know, Georgia sort of reinventing its passing attack in a post-Brock Bowers world. The other thing that makes sort of tangible value of, you know, Nate Frazier and, you know, guys like that in the running game overall is what Georgia's going to do throwing the ball seemingly is made so much easier by kind of a healthy crop of running backs, right? That's why this Frazier thing, or, you know, whatever it may be, and the other stuff around the Georgia running backs, which has all been pretty positive, you know, this is more than just empty rhetoric. Georgia needs all hands on deck offensively, and a fully, I guess, capable, you know, running back situation for UGA. It makes everything about the Georgia offense just a little bit easier to kind of hum along nicely, right?
Absolutely. And I think every defense is trying to say, we're going to take away what you do best and challenge you to beat us with your secondary option. And when teams are balanced, when teams are able to run the football effectively and throw the ball, then, you know, they can't put that extra safety in the box. And if you can run the ball, then they can't just stay in a two shell and take away all your deep threat passing options. It forces them to play a little more balanced. And that's the best friend of any quarterback and all the wide receivers is the ability to run the ball. It creates opportunities for play action pass. It makes them the linebackers a step slower for all routes across the middle or manning up with tight ends. So it is one of their best friends. And it all starts, in my opinion, with the ability to protect and also create holes for both. And with this Georgia offensive line, it sets itself up really well to have a balanced attack. It is one of the major strengths of this team. And in my opinion, the best friend of not only Carson Beck, but in all the offensive weapons, because, they can do both.
Well, speaking of Beck, I thought it was interesting a moment ago, Kirby Smart, we played a clip of saying that Carson Beck perhaps feels maybe a little bit of pressure to kind of get everything right with this Georgia offense because there are going to be so many new faces and what we would think of as kind of expanded roles here for this year. I think pressure is an interesting word for Smart to use in that context. And, John, I have to admit, to a degree, I think some of that's also unavoidable there as well, that there is this spotlight on Beck that I don't know how much he himself has, done to cultivate. He just certainly doesn't seem to, seek a lot of attention with social media and things like that. But there's just sort of a natural, byproduct of being a quarterback. And if Beck doesn't seek it, he has certainly seemingly profited from it. Lamborghini, private jet, famous, at least alleged girlfriend. That there's certainly a benefit that Beck has gotten from the attention that he's received. But now as the season gets ready to begin, there probably is a little bit of pressure in a post-Brock Bowers world to say, okay, well, what can you do to make this offense kind of replicate the success that Georgia's enjoyed in the last couple of seasons? We certainly around here don't want to make it more than it needs to be, but there is an element to which this is just unavoidable, right?
Absolutely. The spotlight's gotten brighter. You're not only the returning starting quarterback for the potential, it's the number one team heading into the country, but also you're the Heisman candidate leader to start the season. So expectations are high. And does that come with a little quote unquote added pressure? Yes. I don't know how that translates. It translates different for different players. And, Carson very easily could respond to it in a way that I fully expect. And he's a man about his business. And even when he was not in the spotlight, he was able to continue to develop and become the player that he is today. I don't see that changing. I think there was a reason why he returned to Georgia. He understood that would come with some added expectations. And it's on a national scale now. I think despite the fact that Georgia continues to compete on an annual basis for national championships, now that he put together his body of work last year, the bar has been raised. And the expectation is that he can take his game to the next step. He's the projected number one pick in the draft. He's the projected Heisman Trophy frontrunner. There are high expectations. And I think in his defense, one, his performance backs that up. And two, he's got the support staff around him that can lead to all those things being fulfilled and him having a successful season.
One of the things I think is going to be fascinating about the game against Clemson is if you go back a year ago, Georgia coaches, by their own admission, were probably a little slow to turn Carson Beck loose. At the time, they weren't really, you would presume, not all that sure with what they had in him. He was beginning his first year as a starting quarterback, and I think they wanted to try to build his confidence early. And so, therefore, maybe against, South Carolina, certainly in the first half, or Auburn, certainly in the first half, maybe they're a little careful with Carson Beck there in that regard. Now, a year later, they know a lot more about what they have with him, and seeing him turn loose and maybe being a little bit more aggressive in what they call for Carson, I think that's a fascinating thing to see, especially in light of the fact that a couple of years ago in that same stadium against Oregon, Georgia scored 7 touchdowns in a row to begin the game. You can't help but think about that a little bit when you think about this game coming up against Clemson, a major offensive statement made in a spot very similar to this. How free and easy do they allow Carson to play from the very beginning of the game against a good Tigers defense? John, that's a really interesting storyline coming up in a couple of weeks, I believe.
And it's a huge bonus for the University of Georgia because it's year 2 in the quote-unquote Bobo system, despite the fact that he's been a part of the entire scheme, even when Monken was at the helm. this is his second true season as the coordinator in that role. But you also have Carson Beck coming back. You have your full suite of weapons. And it's got to be a challenge for Clemson because there's still so much unknown. How Georgia deploys everything, understanding personnel. You have so many different options for personnel groupings and formations and what you're trying to take away. So I think it really sets up well for Georgia in that they've got so many weapons across the board. No Brock Bowers, understood, but you still have highly capable players that can create plays at every position group. You have great running backs, tight ends, and wide receivers. That is a pretty daunting task for a defense. And for a coaching staff like Georgia's, they've had all offseason to prepare and start identifying what each player does really well and create different play sets and establish different trends that they can create opportunities for each guy to really highlight their skill set.
Let's talk about some of those pass-catching weapons for Georgia here for a moment, because we did spend some time before the show began talking about, Georgia showcasing that in its first game without Brock Bowers against Clemson here coming up in a couple of weeks. And I think the one thing, if you're a Georgia fan, you get comfortable with is the fact that the potential list of names here is pretty long, but not everybody's going to have their highest possible projected season. We bet the over a lot before the season begins of how good so-and-so is going to be and how good so-and-so is going to be, but that never quite works out exactly as well as you hope that it would, that there will be kind of a whittling down here. So, John, what is the process of saying, of all the guys who have potential, and for Georgia that's a list as long as my arm, for all the guys who have potential, how do you figure out who you really trust and who you either build the game plan around or Carson Beck's eyes just sort of gravitate to a little bit more? How do you determine that over the course of the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, consistency, right? All training camp, each guy has kind of highlighted what they're capable of. But I think what coaches are looking for more than anything is consistency. Can they execute play after play after play? Not just one big splashy play, not just creating a great catch on a singular effort, but can you do that with consistency? And it's why most likely some of the front runners early on are Dylan Bell and Dom Lovett, guys that have done it in the past and know the system, know that the expectations for all Georgia receivers, not only create in the pass game, but I think what often is undervalued for younger players is their ability to block and be an addition in the run game. To be able to create big runs, you have to have wide receivers that are willing and able to dig out a safety that's down in the box or recognize coverage and run off a defender. These plays are huge for an offense, and it gets you more time. So I think, again, one of the strengths of the wide receiver room is that it is so deep, but there's not an quote unquote that one true front runner, that go-to guy that separated himself out just because of either last year's performance of what he's done so far in camp. But it is a deep position group. So all guys are really battling, and I think it's only going to accentuate their ability to perform on Saturday. So I'm excited to see who it is. I know, some guys have been a little slowed up because of, minor injuries during training camp, but that's kind of the nature of the beast, especially with such a long season. There's going to be, periods of the season that, guys are unavailable and other folks are going to have to step up. And that's where I think Georgia's done a really good job of creating the depth specifically in that wide receiver room that will kind of allow for the absorption of players not being available. Now, week 1 versus Clemson, there is still some ambiguity as to, what that deployment will look like and how that rotation will be. But I feel fairly certain it's still going to be a deep rotation of guys that are rolling through those positions.
I'm sure I've asked you some version of this question 1,000 times, but in light of this discussion, is there one name that's interesting to you, maybe more so than others, whether it's somebody we haven't really seen very much of or somebody we're about to see more of in a different role, wide receiver, tight end, whatever else? Is there a pass-catching target ahead of this upcoming season that you're particularly interested in right now?
Well, I mean, Colby Young, new face, new name for us. I think he's just such a big target. That's probably where I start. I'd also go with Evans, another guy that, we saw in the bowl game this past season, just his ability to be dynamic, and he's got some serious burst. So there's a couple guys in the wide receiver room that are exciting. And then I also think, what about the tight ends? Oscar Delp, he's the expectation certainly can't be that he's the next Brock Bowers, but he has shown that very capable pass catcher and is dynamic once he gets the ball in his hands. So probably not as dynamic as Brock is, and that they were running the jet sweeps with him and creating screens, but is a mismatch for most linebackers and some safeties just because of his athleticism and frame.
Let me finish on this topic, if you don't mind. I mentioned before Georgia played Oregon a couple of years ago, and everybody on TV loves games like that because it's like the Pacific Northwest against the Southeast. It's these two programs from very different worlds kind of meeting on the same field, kind of a rarity. And obviously we saw Georgia go to Notre Dame a few years ago, and goodness knows that was – treated this amazing novelty, and everybody seems to really like that. However, Georgia-Clemson to me is fascinating for the exact opposite reason. And, John, this really matters. Beyond just what's Georgia going to look like, and is Dabo Swinney still among the national elite when it comes to coaches and programs, and, beyond just the regular storylines, there is something to be said for non-conference game against a team in your same geographic area, close proximity, about an hour up the road. You fight for many of the same recruits, with Georgia winning the majority of those battles here in recent years, but nonetheless a kind of nemesis that's not going to quite go away. Used to be a rival, now it's maybe more of just a nemesis, but nonetheless, this is still a very intriguing opponent because of the long history that these two teams have with each other. And you know this as well as maybe anybody we could talk to because, your senior season began different circumstances, but it began with a game against Clemson. So ahead of all the talk of the tale of the tape and who has the advantage and how's the game decided, how about just sort of the big picture here 2 weeks out of what does it mean to begin a season against a regional rival, not in your conference? You don't play them every year anymore, but still a lot of folks like me have long memories of back in the 80s when a game like this would have mattered more so than anything else. What does it mean for Georgia to begin a season against Clemson?
Yeah, I think it's huge. And for the reason that Clemson, the way they view this game is this is their fight for relevance. This is their fight for continued having their name a part of the discussion on a national scene. If they can win this game, then it shows, or at least they're going to be able to vie for the recruits and for the national attention that it would garner knocking off the number one team in the country. Even though it's just a preseason ranking, for Clemson, they see this as their opportunity to show that their program hasn't jumped the shark. And for Georgia, it shows that they're still the dominant force in this region. And to be candid, I think it's a scary proposition because Clemson is going to put so much on this game. They're going to see this, not only the players, the coaching staff, the fan base. They see this as an opportunity to say we are still a major player for the game of college football. So for recruits, for the overall program, for the discussion of, we are still a part of the discussion. This game is huge for them. And for Georgia, you look at it and say, golly, we've got a number of big time games that are really important. And that's the opportunities that you earn when you are that perennial number one, at least that in the discussion for it. But for this game in particular, it needs to matter, and I'm sure it does for all of Georgia. One, not only is it the start to your season, but for recruiting. Let's start there. I think it is vitally important to show that there is still separation, that there is still a dominant force in the Southeast that is consistent, and that's the University of Georgia.
Any quick thought? This is like 5 seconds because obviously I know that that's not what you're probably paying the most attention to. We also got Florida State and Clemson, and Florida State and Georgia Tech coming up on Saturday. That to me is a really fun week zero type of deal here. I sort of think Tech has a chance to keep that game close. Any early thought on a game week involving two teams that Georgia fans feel like they know pretty well?
Yeah, so despite some of Coach Key's rhetoric this offseason, which I'll be honest has been a little off-putting for me personally, I'm actually excited for Georgia Tech, and I think they are an arrow-up program. I would love to see Florida State get knocked down yet another peg, especially because of all of their commentary leading up to and after the bowl game where Georgia embarrassed them and how they, still feel like they're riding high. I'd love to see them get knocked down a peg, and I hope that Georgia Tech does more than just make it a close game.
Oh, wow. How about that? Would you like to see Georgia play a game in Ireland to begin the season? That's a long way away. It's a very expensive trip. Is that, like you got USC and LSU playing in Las Vegas. That feels to me like a great place for a week one game. Would love to see Georgia in Las Vegas. Ireland, I guess, would be fun, but man, that's a lot to do to get out there and only have to turn around and play, I'm presuming, somebody else the following Saturday there as well. You want to see the Dawgs in Ireland?
No, I think it's unique. I think it's fun, but I think there's plenty of college towns that I would love to see Georgia play in and play against well before we cross the pond and go over to a place like Ireland.
Yeah, I would think I'd probably agree with you there on that, John, although I'm sure plenty of Georgia fans would love to make that trip nonetheless. John, we appreciate your time. Thanks for everything you do to get us ready for the 2024 season. We're basically there. Next week will, of course, be game week for Georgia. We can't wait for all of that. We'll look forward to talking to you more about that then, and thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Palo Window and Door of Georgia.
I can't wait. We are getting really close to being able to comment directly about Georgia football and not just leading up to it. So can't wait. Go Dogs. Appreciate it, BA.
Good stuff, John. Thanks.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, to me, Dublin is a town you got to slow down in on your way down I-16 across toward Savannah. Like, there's Dublin's like Ireland, but to me, Dublin is Lawrence County. And you got to be careful because the speed traps are always out down there. That to me is what I think of when I think of Dublin. But for the more cosmopolitan, international members of our DawgNation community, I'm sure they'd love to go to Ireland here at some point in time. Maybe we'll see Georgia doing that. As I said before, my taste on that might be a little bit more along the lines of USC, LSU, season opener in Las Vegas. That feels about right for me. But maybe one of these days we'll see Georgia in Ireland. Here's what I do know, though. There's beautiful coast, obviously, in Ireland. Not quite always as warm. But if you love that kind of thing, then you're going to love what Royal Caribbean has in store for you there as well. I saw some social media chatter this past weekend. Folks talking about me and the excitement about Utopia of the Seas. And when you're watching a video, when you see the pool deck like that, how much do you love what Royal Caribbean has done to make the pool deck better and better and better on each and every one of these ships, whether it be the view bar, which is an incredible, it's almost like a really cool rooftop bar, but instead of looking out over the town, you look out over the ocean and the expanse there, the gorgeous view. The Lime and Coconut, which is sort of a famous, obviously, bar they've had around the pool area for a long time. That's even bigger now. It's a couple of different levels. That's an incredible thing to see. You get the spare tire, the really fun kind of food truck type, vibe that, exists around the pool deck there, where you can get even more complimentary food as you enjoy your time at the pool. You don't have to go back inside and get dressed to go eat lunch. You can just eat right there around the pool area. Royal Caribbean really listening to what people want and trying to create their ship experiences around all of that. The water slides are bigger and better than they've ever been before. All of the ways to enjoy the best of really what you go on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation for. Fun in the sun, out there on the pool deck, enjoying all of that, perhaps a little bit of a beverage in hand as you do. Trust me when I tell you, that is what it's all about. And our friend Jessica Slater knows that full well. She's a travel agent. She doesn't work for Royal Caribbean. She works with Royal Caribbean. And Royal Caribbean introduced us to her years ago as a way of saying, hey, you want to book your Royal Caribbean cruise vacation? You can make it even better when you work with a terrific travel agent. We certainly believe that's what Jessica is. So you can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She'll get you ready for our DawgNation cruise in April or any experience you want to have on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship here as we roll through 2024 into 2025. All right, so as John and I were just discussing, it is game week for college football. We got week 0 on tap for Saturday. I am fascinated by Georgia Tech and Florida State. I keep saying Clemson. Georgia Tech and Florida State, I'm fascinated by the game. Obviously, a year ago, this was a Georgia Tech team that took some strides towards improvement with, Buster Faulkner as offensive coordinator, with Haynes King at quarterback, and they, clearly gave, Georgia a challenging game to end the season. Can they pick up on that? Can they build on that here to begin 2024? Perhaps they can. I will admit I'm a lot more interested in what Florida State looks like because, as we've said before, there's a tradition seemingly of a team ranked in the top 10 to begin the season, the preseason AP top 25, finishing unranked. I don't know that Florida State will fall quite that far here this year, but if you look for that top 10 team that has some vulnerabilities, I think by appearances, Florida State certainly feels like that kind of team. As I've said now a couple of times, DJ Uiagalelei, the Florida State quarterback, this is a guy at this point in time we sort of feel like we know. We saw him at Oregon State. We saw him at Clemson. And the word special just does not really come to mind to describe his game. If Uiagalelei is all he's been so far, if that's what he is for Florida State here this year, y'all, this is not the same level of offense that Jordan Travis was providing when healthy a year ago, and a Florida State team that's probably a far cry from its at least playoff contending status last season. Now, the other kind of offshoot of that is, let's say that Florida State does win on Saturday against Georgia Tech, but they don't play necessarily all that well in doing so. Keep in mind that somebody from the ACC is going to make the college football playoff. So who is it? Is it the emergence of a team like Miami? We'll see them next Saturday against Florida. That somebody from the ACC is going to be that team. Clemson hopes it's still them. We've talked about them plenty on today's show. But Florida State trying to kind of give you some indication of what they have left over from an ACC championship this past season. That's what this upcoming Saturday is going to be all about. One of the things I wanted to kind of mention here as we get up closer to the start of the year, a couple of transfer players around the SEC that are perhaps kind of flying, below the radar. We'll get to some of that here coming up in a moment. But prior to that, let me also mention really kind of a big last few days for Tennessee in recruiting. And the name of note, perhaps most of all here, is the 5-star offensive tackle. Not unexpectedly, David Sanders has committed to Tennessee. This really ends up being a really big loss for, and you see on video here, you see the image we showed you before of not exactly the most Instagram-worthy meal being served by Clemson, and to make matters worse, Tennessee, and to make matters worse, the fact that they spelled his name wrong on the placard in front of his plate when he took his official visit there. The Vols kind of getting that wrong, but surviving that in order to win the recruiting battle. If you're watching on video, of course, you see that. And this, by the time it was all said and done, was not necessarily unexpected. Ends up being a really big loss for Clemson because at one point, Clemson was sort of the believed favorite here. That was kind of thought to be a little bit of a dream school type for Sanders. They fell by the wayside pretty quickly. It was Ohio State for a while. And Tennessee, kind of a consistent threat here. We would presume a lot of NIL dollars. They have a fairly sophisticated NIL apparatus around their program, using it for a player like this. Georgia, to its credit, I think, a year after all kinds of offensive line wins, remained a fairly persistent threat in this, but never, I don't think anybody's viewed the favorite here. So Tennessee, it's an example of what I said before. In the Josh Heupel era, Georgia has dominated Tennessee on the field. But that domination has not quite equaled annihilation. The fact that Tennessee as a program is still kind of hanging around. They're winning their share of recruiting battles. They're a number 15 team to begin this season on the field. They are still a factor in college football, despite the fact they're not coming all that close against Georgia on the field, at least for right now. Speaking of games that were not close, let's go back to 2012 for a moment, long time ago. But you may have seen Manti Te'o, former Notre Dame linebacker, and sort of a now it can be told type of thing here, admitting that he and his Notre Dame teammates, when they saw Alabama prior to the 2012 national championship game, the BCS national championship game, the much ballyhooed BCS national championship game, they looked around, they saw the size difference, and they knew they were in trouble there that day. That's something that Te'o has recently admitted. Obviously not the only secret he kept for quite some time. But nonetheless, Teo admitting that, and that caused former Alabama quarterback A.J. McCarron to go on social media this week, kind of just basically calling out Notre Dame for being a weak team in that game, mentally, physically, just a weak team overall. And obviously, this is one of those things that's kind of always going to sort of stick in the craw of some Georgia fans here a little bit, in that Georgia was so close to beating Alabama in that 2012 SEC championship. If they'd found a way to do that, if they could just one more play, obviously the tough, clock running out right there at the goal line, just would have been such an opportunity for Georgia to get that national championship, because Georgia would have pushed over Notre Dame and pushed around Notre Dame, we think, just as badly as Alabama did. So for Georgia fans, there's always going to be that little bit of frustration there about all of that. But beyond that, I'll also say this, which is, you want to talk about how much college football has changed since then? I mean, I think back then, I think a lot of people, especially the media types who are never quite as plugged in as the sport as you sort of sometimes wish they would be, I think they sort of saw Notre Dame and Alabama as a game among equals, and Manti Te'o as a player on par with the best of what Alabama had, too. And obviously that was laughable in the moment, and certainly laughable immediately after the moment. And now Notre Dame can admit, no, we didn't have the same level of player that Alabama did. But I think one of the reasons why, there's a certain edge to a lot of SEC fans, perhaps sometimes Georgia fans, is because this is the kind of nonsense that we used to have to tolerate. This thought of, Notre Dame is just as good as anybody in the SEC, or some other team somewhere else is just as good as the SEC, even though visually it was obvious that a lot of those players, not only could they not start for Alabama or a Georgia team like that, they couldn't play. They just didn't belong on the same field. It was recognizably obvious. And now I think our understanding of the sport now makes those kinds of errors a little less likely, but they still occasionally occur, that there is just a level of the sport played down here in SEC country that's not matched anywhere else. And the arrival of the recruiting rankings, a little bit more of the mainstream conversation, now makes that a little bit easier to help people understand. But there was a time, frankly, not all that long ago, where you could be easily fooled, and some media members seem to on a regular basis. Now to get to what I said a moment ago, which is a couple of transfer players that I think are probably worth your attention here a little bit prior to the start of the season. I saw where South Carolina coach Shane Beamer was touting his guy, Rocket Sanders. This is the running back who comes to South Carolina by way of Arkansas, saying that he had a really good scrimmage with the Gamecocks the other day. And this is obviously a South Carolina team a year ago that was decimated by the transfer portal. And really one of the things that prevented them from having a winning season was the fact, and not making a bowl game, was the fact that they had lost so much by way of transfer. We'll see, what the roster looks like overall here for this season. But if you want to think about how South Carolina this year could be a little different than it was a year ago, building some form of the offense around Sanders is obviously seemingly very, very important. I'll admit, the Gamecocks quarterback situation seems a little strange here. Lenore Sellers as your starter, Robbie Ashford, who says he's still vying to be the starter himself, although we saw him be pretty average to below average at Auburn. The Gamecock quarterback situation is pretty weird. But Rocket Sanders, when healthy, has been a pretty good running back in the SEC. And Shane Beamer says he's doing well for South Carolina here right now. So perhaps something to file away here for maybe one of the better backs in the SEC in a program in South Carolina who could be leaning on him pretty heavily. Speaking of Sanders' old school Arkansas, I also thought this was kind of interesting. Did you see where Malachi Nelson's a former five-star quarterback? He was at USC. Lincoln Riley didn't seem to be all that impressed by him. Nelson leaves there. You wonder where he might transfer to. He made the somewhat surprising decision to go to a group of five school. He goes to Boise State. Well, the surprises don't stop there. We found out this weekend, I think Pete Thamel reported this first, that Nelson did not win the starting quarterback job at Boise State. Somebody else did. So maybe Boise State's got themselves a very good quarterback. Maybe Nelson's just not the quarterback we thought he was. But it also kind of brought to mind for me one of the things that below the radar, kind of behind the scenes, people have been saying here a little bit, that Talon Green, last year's starting quarterback, who had been at Boise State, very quietly transferred to Arkansas. Now, I don't think Arkansas is going to be any kind of surprise team in the SEC or anything like that. I think their schedule is just too difficult to make that a possibility. But we'll tell you this. There are a lot of people who have been saying that Green has been looking pretty good for Arkansas as of late, and that Arkansas very quietly might have gotten themselves a quarterback who may end up being, a very solid starter by SEC standards with almost no fanfare around him. And part of the reason that he quietly transferred to Arkansas may have been because Boise State thought they had something in Malachi Nelson. Well, as it turns out, Nelson's not their starter, and Green's now at Arkansas. Keep your eye on, if you're thinking about, games closer than experts think they're supposed to be or potential for upsets, keep your eye on Taylor Green at Arkansas. There is some chatter out there that Arkansas may have themselves a pretty good quarterback when it comes to Green, and we'll see if it plays out that way. We'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I also want to wrap up here in a moment with a couple of recruiting notes. Prior to that, as promised, let me give you a reminder about our DawgNation Invasion events coming up 2 Saturdays from now. Of course, you know about our DawgNation Invasion tailgate downtown Atlanta, just steps from Mercedes-Benz Stadium prior to the start of the game. This is the breakfast-themed tailgate ahead of the noon start, which means Bloody Marys, mimosas, bacon sausage, muffins, I'm sure biscuits, all that kind of stuff, and obviously a great DawgNation Invasion T-shirt that obviously pays homage to the cool theme for our tailgate here right now. Breakfast of Champions for Georgia and Clemson next Saturday. Georgia enjoying those national championships, and a really cool tailgate to kick off the 2024 season. So get your tickets right now so you can make sure you get one of these DawgNation Invasion T-shirts to go along with that. It's going to be a great day in partnership with our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips. We're going to have a great time next Saturday. And speaking of Atlanta Sports Trips, they're also right now, through our friends at Discover Dunwoody, giving you a chance to plus your experience with a VIP opportunity the night before the game. You can stay in Dunwoody the night before the game, which is always a great spot when you're thinking about activities in downtown. Dunwoody, a great place to stay, at the Hyatt Place Perimeter Center. And that next morning, you can get on a luxury motor coach, travel to the game, which means you're not messing with parking, you're not messing with, driving. You're driving to the game from the Hyatt Place Perimeter Center in the bus, enjoy the tailgate, go to the game, hop on the bus, and then come right back after the game. You'll also get tickets to the DawgNation Invasion tailgate, which includes the Atlanta Sports Trip swag bag and the DawgNation Invasion T-shirt. So go to atlsportstrips.com to find out more about that. So if you just want the tailgate, that's DawgNation.com/tailgate. If you want the VIP experience to go along with the tailgate, that's atlsportstrips.com to find out more about that. All right, before we wrap up today, let's give you a couple of recruiting notes. First of all, on Wednesday, a little disappointed for our Corky Kell Dave Hunter Classic. Did not get a chance to see Chase Linton play for North Atlanta. Was really hoping to see the edge rusher perform because there has been some chatter as of late as relates to Linton and Georgia. A couple of days ago, that chatter involving Linton and the Dawgs only intensified even more because Linton, who previously had been committed to Rutgers, as many of you are aware, he backed off that pledge. This is what Linton put out on social media about that. My family and I had an amazing experience with Rutgers and met great coaches and athletes. So it's very difficult to post this, but at this time, I am reopening my recruitment, Chase Linton says, the edge rusher from North Atlanta High School. And a lot of people think that Georgia could be the team that gains here from the Linton decommitment. In fact, you can read more about that from Jeff Sintel at DawgNation.com. But in addition to that, Linton, who had been a Rutgers commit, right now, that's not the only Rutgers commit who's perhaps also generating some buzz as it relates to the Dawgs. How about Braxton Kyle, the defensive lineman from North Gwinnett? If you're watching us on Saturday evening, Kyle was amazing in North Gwinnett's win against McCarron on Saturday at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. He had an interception. He had a sack that turned into a scoop and score on a fumble. A dominant defensive line performance from Kyle. So much so that Kyle, and I love when this happens, you get the big boost from having played on television. Apparently the folks from Texas were watching this game from Braxton Kyle. They immediately sent the offer out, and Chase Linton on social media was also celebrating that for Kyle, kind of giving him a little bit of a signal boost here after Kyle put out on X that he received an offer from Texas. This is right after the game on Saturday in which he had played so well against McCarron. So Linton likes that. The point here is not that Braxton Kyle's going to go to Texas. The point here is that Kyle also himself has a Georgia offer. So you got a situation in which Chase Linton a former Rutgers commit who's now thought to be very close to Georgia, reacting to a guy like Braxton Kyle, also currently committed to Rutgers, but a guy who has a Georgia offer and a star that's now seemingly on the rise after a big performance with us on TV, getting the attention of the likes of Texas. So things could be about to get very interesting for Georgia when it comes to either a current or former or Rutgers commit, as the Dogs have a lot in the kind of irons in the fire here when it comes to the class of 2024 overall. And by the way, how great was it to have high school football back this weekend as well? In fact, with that in mind, we'll get ready to wrap up today's show with our golden shoe here too. So you see on the screen there, if you're watching on video, me and my buddy Rusty Manziel from Mercedes-Benz Stadium got a couple nice notes about that, including Josh McElvery, who said, "It's the most wonderful time of year, watching DawgNation Daily call the Corky Kell Classic. Great way to kick off the most wonderful time of the year. Hashtag 'tis the season." Josh, it means so much to me that you'd watch. And also, I think the same way you do. That event, the Corky Kell Dave Hunter Classic, is for me the thing that really signals and indicates that the season really is here. And so I'm glad to know that you kind of think of it the same way, Josh. That truly means a lot to me. Dustin also had some very nice words there as well about us. He says, listen to the show every day at lunch, then getting to listen to DawgNation Daily call a football game on Saturday evening. He gives some very, very kind words there. And Dustin, I really appreciate that for you too. So I'd love to give you a golden shoe as a way of saying thank you for some nice compliments there. And we just appreciate all of you tuning in, being a part of what we did. We'll give golden shoes all around on that. Lousy, stinking Gators, man, they don't have anything seemingly going on for them in the positive light here right now. It's been a long time since they've beaten Georgia as well, about 1,381 days. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. Back here tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews is one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. I'm going to get some comments here. We'll find out what people have on their mind today ahead of a big season here coming up. Let's see what else. Crow King asking if week 0 is this weekend. Crow King, it is indeed. It is indeed. Randy Payne in here with his moniker that he sort of created, Eat Off the Floor in 2024. Randy, I love that. I'm glad to see you. Speaking of our DawgNation crews, Randy is a great part of our DawgNation crews. Appreciate that. Frank Patterson says, I bet you and Stinch would love to play in Ireland if we were playing Notre Dame. So, yeah, maybe so. And I shouldn't say that I wouldn't like to play in Ireland. I'm just not as into, like, that crazy travel as maybe some other people are. Like, to me, you look forward to the season, and the Ireland game is such a weird one-off, right? Long trip, completely different environment. I mean, I'm sure Georgia fans would take the place over, as they do so many other places. That, for me, is just not as much fun as, like, as John said, sort of a regular college football environment. Maybe I'm just too basic, but I like the regular college football environment, would probably prefer that over the alternative, but I'm sure plenty of Georgia fans would love to do that. Lance D says, it doesn't matter to me who's playing this weekend, just happy to get real football back. And by the way, he says, I hope Tech throttles Free Shoes University. So, Florida State has made some enemies among Georgia fans here, so much so that some fans willing to even cheer for Georgia Tech in the process. Matt Presley says, what are you hearing about Cole Speer, and how about Arian Smith? Well, I'll tell you this. When I saw Cole Speer at Calhoun back when he was in high school, I thought he was very much a kind of a, what would you think of, sort of a plus athlete. Like, he wasn't just a good runner. He was also a pretty physical presence for them on their defense. So much so that not only was Speer obviously earning a Georgia scholarship, when I saw Speer play in high school, I thought he could play at Georgia. I did, and I probably eventually would play at Georgia. I know there was a lot of positive chatter. I think it was on social media, from Speer here this weekend, and I don't know what that means for the actual season itself, but I had certainly heard there was, plenty of that, that Speer seemingly had a nice day on Saturday. At least that's what the internet is telling you here right now. Does that translate to this season? I'm not sure. Do I think that Speer is truly good enough to play at Georgia? I definitely do. Like, not just occupy a roster spot, but eventually have a spot on the field for Georgia. I definitely think that's the case for Spear. Frank Patterson says, has anybody in Ireland ever seen a drunk, obnoxious Georgia fan? Yeah, you better believe that's a little bit different brand of the imbibing, I'm sure. Let's see what else. Spencer Clark says, Jerome Bettis is my favorite Notre Dame player. Bettis, who obviously lives in the Atlanta area. His son plays for Woodward Academy. Spencer Clark says, I hope Tate Ratledge stays healthy this year. I love his game. Yeah, Ratledge, a big part of what Georgia's going to do. Let's see what else. Greg Rosenberg says, we lose to Auburn last year without Brock Bowers. He did the Superman thing. Not sure we have a Superman player this year. Well, I would agree with that, Greg. I also hope that, at least in terms of a game like that Georgia doesn't quite need the same level of Superman performance. I would at least hope that's the case. That Georgia kind of gets back to some of its more comfortable wins. But there's no doubt, and that's one of the reasons why the discussion around replacing Brock Bowers is such an important one, is because in games like that, we saw just how good he really is. I mean, they were just feeding him over and over and over again, and Bowers just kept being equal to the task each and every time. That gives you an idea of how good he truly is. Let's see what else. G. Gray says we lost the Rome linebacker to Tennessee yesterday. He flipped. Is that Harmon? I thought he was already a Tennessee commit. Am I G. Grace, am I getting that wrong? Harmon, the Rome linebacker, was a Tennessee commit, right? Maybe I'm getting that wrong. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on. Spencer Clark says Ashford's going to be South Carolina's best running back. Maybe so, but I do think that Rocket Sanders has a chance to have a nice season for them. I do. I think he's got a chance to have a nice season. Let's see what else. Greg Roseberg talking about, is it Ja Jackson, the former basketball player, playing football for Georgia? Yep, a lot of people really like what he brings to the table. Let's see what's going on over here at DawgNation.com for a moment there, too. JP says the Auburn game last year, anyone that knows college football would see it coming a mile away. Beck's first road, SEC start, Freeze's first shot at a signature win at home. They threw the sink at us, and we still won. Yeah, and, obviously, Auburn has a long history of being very good at home. Georgia, for the most part, have been somewhat impervious to that. But Auburn's obviously made a history out of, playing far better at Jordan-Hare Stadium than it plays anywhere else. And so that's one of the reasons why, when you think about best home field environments, I mean, as much as it pains me to admit, I'd have to put Auburn up there near the top, just from the standpoint that the performance you get week to week from Auburn, home compared to the road, I don't know that there's a wider split anywhere in college football in terms of what you get week to week than what Auburn brings to the table. So Randy Hall says that Harmon was an Alabama commit who flipped to Tennessee. He's a good player. We didn't get a chance to see Rome on Friday, but I've seen Harmon before. He's a good player. Is this his second time of being committed to Tennessee? I swear I could have thought he was already committed to Tennessee. DT, thank you for the kind words. Appreciate that. Love working with Rusty. Either way, Harmon's going to Tennessee now. I guess the Alabama commit, I missed that. I could have sworn a year ago he was committed to Tennessee then. But maybe I'm wrong. But DT, thanks for the kind words about that. I appreciate that. Rambo says, let's run the ball on those Tigers and stop them from running against us. Rambo, I like that. Let's see what else. Scott Harris says, what time is the Florida State-Georgia Tech game? JP says it's noon. I wasn't sure about that, so there you go. Um, Scott Harris talking about staying in Edinburgh, which is in Scotland. Now, let me be clear about something. I'd love to go to both Ireland and Scotland for non-college football reasons, especially Scotland. Something about that just seems amazing to me. That just seems amazing. I would love to do that. Dave Snow says Edinburgh is super. Glasgow, which is also in Scotland, seemed more gritty and less historic, but got me close to Le Mans and Highlands Tour. We were doing the Commando Memorial. I mean, such an interesting place. Such an interesting place. Really interesting stuff. By the way, Dave has lived, quite an interesting life. Obviously, living in Kenya now and traveling all through Europe like that. Scott Harris says, I think a win against Bama this year is essential after the coaching change. Put this to bed. Yeah, Scott, I think you got to get that win against Alabama coming up in a couple of weeks for sure. DT also says, really want to see Miami lay the wood to Florida in the swamp following the Dawgs beat down of Clemson. Yeah, I mean, week one, I'd say it's probably not the best week one we've ever had, but it ain't bad either. And another game I'm excited about, I think you're right about Miami and Florida being an unbelievably compelling game. I think Notre Dame, Texas A&M is going to be really rich with drama too. And y'all can obviously, give me all your Texas A&M jokes if you like. But that's a team that thinks it can be something very quiet right now in the SEC. On the flip side, you know that if you care about betting odds, Notre Dame's minus 200 to make the college football playoff, which means, they're essentially a heavy favorite to be in the playoff. Minus is a number designated for a favorite, plus is an underdog. And so they're a minus 200 favorite to make the playoff. We talked the other day about the stats I sort of care about, very, very simple counting stats. Top 10 points scored, top 10 points allowed, top 10 yards per play, top 10 yards per play allowed. That's typically a stat in which Georgia's kind of in the top 10 in all four of those categories. Last year, only team to make top 10 in all four of those categories was Notre Dame. That the Irish here, with Riley Leonard at quarterback, they're kind of thinking they have a chance to be something. That's a good game, too, week one. Excited about having all this back, y'all. Very, very excited indeed. What else week one-wise are we excited about? Other than those three, Georgia, Clemson, Miami, Florida. Are you excited about LSU, USC? My assumption is that LSU wallops USC, but I guess seeing that happen would be, to a degree, exciting. What else week one matters? Jacob O'Neill says, hey, we're over here also. We're here now. Al Chandler says, if you had a composite rating for our receiver group with Brock and Ladd at about 80, this year as a group rating, we're very close to the same. I certainly hope that turns out to be true. I do. William Camacho says, will you be calling the Rome-Carrollton game next Friday? I don't think we're doing that one. I don't think. But, boy, I wish we were. That's a good game. I will tell you this, though. We're actually doing a different game that night, which is also going to be really good. Our regular season schedule for Peachtree Sports Network is as good as it's been. We have a bunch of unbelievable games. Really excited about these. In fact, that night we're doing, I believe that's the night we're doing Gainesville-Westlake. That's going to be a fantastic game, and obviously Juan Gaston, the Georgia commit there in that. Gainesville, one of the best teams in the state, now in 5A. That's going to be really good. Bill Radford warning about the Falcons being sneaky contenders. I know they've made a couple of very big, prior to the start of the season moves here. You bring in the safety, you bring the pass rusher. A lot of Falcons fans are very excited about all that. Philip Jordan Wells in here speaking Spanish. Chad Buchanan says, start fast, stay fast, no let up from game one all the way to the Natty. Chad, that sounds like a good idea. Bill Sanders says Georgia will not need a Superman-type player this year, even though they have several who could potentially be that kind of player. Let's see what else. Yeah, so good stuff here on the Facebook side of things. Jacob O'Neill says that Philip's been speaking Spanish the entire day. Is that authentic, or is he using a translator app? Gerald Harmon, let me read this from Gerald. He says, I want to see 5 high school players this year. Juju, Travis Smith, Justice, and the offensive lineman at Langston and Westlake. Yeah, that's a pretty good collection of players to see, Gerald. Pretty good collection indeed. Bill Sanders also mentioned some of those great Central Georgia games. Yeah, that region down there that all those teams in is incredibly tough. What do you have, like 3 state champs from this past year in the same region here this year? That's wild. And there are a lot of people who have been talking up Peach County as having a very good, kind of being back. In fact, that was our comment section of the day. Some love for Peach County in here. Robert Brown ready to see if the defensive line can step it up this year. I'm excited about that too. We'll come back to Facebook here in a moment. Let's see what else is going on. John Hendricks says he's never been to a Buc-ee's. It's free plug, of course, but I do love Buc-ee's. I do. I saw where who was it? The country singer, why am I blanking on his name? He's married to Nicole Kidman, the one that did the concert at Buc-ee's this weekend. Why am I blanking on his name? Famous, incredibly famous guy. Did the concert at Buc-ee's this weekend. Oh, how about this? How about Chief, this is not Chief, this is Chef Jay Bowen, who says, at my work, I made a Dr. Pepper creamy coconut milkshake using Bluebell ice cream and Dr. Pepper creamy coconut. That is why you're the chef right there. That sounds like an amazing concoction. That sounds really, really good. That's a really good idea. Chef Jay, that is really good stuff. Jay Shipe says the brisket sandwich at Buc-ee's is not bad. No, it's not. I like it a lot. Best gas station food, I'd say, anywhere. Of like major, like there's always going to be that one gas station that has like the one-off that always has like the Great Biscuit or something like that. That's a sort of a Southern staple. But of like the chain gas stations, no better gas station food than the Buc-ee's brisket. There's nothing comes close to that. It's not smoky necessarily, but it is good. They make it, all day long. For sure. It's not cheap. Yeah, Jay Shipes, not Jay Shipes, Jay Black, our producer. Goodness knows Jay Shipes couldn't get a job here. Jay Black, our producer, yeah, not cheap. It's not cheap. You're paying full freight retail for it, but I would say worth it. I'd say worth it. Keith Urban, thank you, Lance Deuce. Keith Urban, who did the concert at the Buc-ee's in Alabama. That's where he did the show from, I believe. G. Gray says, I wait to get my gas there at Buc-ee's, so there you go. Of course, G. Grace has to live with the indignity of knowing that Auburn has a Buc-ee's. Tuscaloosa does not. I guess the closest Buc-ee's to Tuscaloosa is at Leeds, right there near Birmingham. That's the closest to Tuscaloosa, I believe. John Hendricks says the closest Buc-ee's to me is just south of Brunswick. So has that one opened up? I know they were building one in Brunswick. Has that opened up? Because that's a game changer. Game changer right there on 95 to have that. Jay Shipes. Took a little jab there at Jay. Very funny response. Yeah, Chef Jay said that creamy coconut Dr. Pepper and milkshake was delicious. That's awesome stuff, Jay. That's good stuff. Yeah, I would say the Buc-ee's I go to the most is the one in Fort Valley. That's the one I've probably been to the most. Probably Calhoun second. And probably the one in Leeds, probably third. Brandon Dowdy says we got one, speaking of the one there in Calhoun, it's always packed. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You can go to, you can go at 3 o'clock in the morning. You can go at 8 a.m. You can go at noon. There's just no time when it's not really packed. I love that. That's why I think it's weird, and goodness knows I'm not getting into all this, but like Cracker Barrel made this big thing the other day where, like, they're going to get away from, like, the old country store. They're going to be sort of trying to, like, reimagine their brand or some nonsense like this. And they're like, we just have to. We're not relevant anymore. But to me, that doesn't make any sense given the fact that Buc-ee's, which is essentially Cracker Barrel gas station, like, has never been more popular. Like, it's one of the most, like, word-of-mouth brands in the whole world. People love Buc-ee's, which is a very similar shtick to what Cracker Barrel is. How could Cracker Barrel not be relevant when Buc-ee's has got the same shtick and they could not be more relevant? Something about that's very suspicious to me. Frank Patterson says, who you got in the Florida-Miami game? I mean, it's hard not to like Miami. I guess the question for me would be, does Florida get the kind of quarterback play that allows them to at least keep it close? But I don't think there's any way Florida's beating Miami, one of many losses we think the Gators probably suffer. Now, this is a little bit outside the bounds of what we typically talk about, but if y'all follow this mess with the Florida president, Ben Sass, the Florida president, alleged, I guess you could say it, financial improprieties, like, that's a real issue. So much so, you can make a case that if Napier has a bad enough year where you're considering firing him, if the Florida president's, like, trying to beat back his own investigation against him for impropriety, allegedly, of course, there may not be anybody to fire Billy Napier. If you're a Florida fan, you've at least got to be aware of, what's happening on the academic side of your campus as a real issue here right now. All right, quick trip around the rest of the comment sections, and then we'll be done. Back on Facebook for a moment. William Camacho checking out. William, we're glad to have you here. Miriam Corbin says Cracker Barrel should not change. I love that place. I would agree with that. Randy Hall says a general manager at Buc-ee's can make $250,000 a year. Yeah, you always see those signs when you go there. Here's what I'm telling you, though. I bet that's hard work. I bet that's real work. And not saying that, for $250,000, I guess it probably should be. I bet that's way more hard work than you think it is because you're open 24 hours. There aren't very many businesses left anymore that are open 24 hours. Like, think about business other than Waffle House that used to be 24 hours. Like, there's just not a lot of 24-hour places left anymore. That's a really tough thing to manage. A lot of employees. I bet being a general manager for Buc-ee's is hard work. Hard work. Randy Hall says Anderson, South Carolina is going to be getting a Buc-ee's in 2025. There was that thing back on April Fool's Day where supposedly that I always think stuff like this is funny because, like, it's benign enough that it seems like it should be true, and then it's come to find out it's not. There was this thing that, like, Pendergrass, Georgia, was going to get a Buc-ee's. It was just like a dumb April Fool's joke, I believe. But, like, the whole world in my little corner of the world was, like, all about, Pendergrass getting a Buc-ee's. But come to find out it's not true. Nick Roundtree says there's a Buc-ee's coming to Glenn County. Billy Mathis likes his Dr. Pepper creamy coconut with some rum. Yeah, we try not to, obviously advertise it this way because, but there are some obvious pairings that would go with something like that. And I'm like, I know y'all, I know 90% of you, or at least a huge portion of you that love the Dr. Pepper creamy coconut, and the creamy coconut zero sugar. I know half of y'all are mixing it with something else. I know my audience. Marshall Fleming says the night shift people there start at $32 an hour. Yeah, look, that's the big thing about any kind of place like that. It's actually kind of a fascinating business type thing where, like, most businesses fail because of high overhead. The cash flow can't keep up with the outgo, right? So a business like that, they try to put themselves in such a unique category by creating this incredibly high overhead, quality employees, well-lit store, well-stocked, kind of efficiently run. You can go to one of those stores at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's going to be better than your average retail establishment, at noon, right? I mean, retail's obviously having some tough times. Tough times when it comes to retail overall. And so what is a perceived disadvantage for a brick and mortar store, they try to turn into their ultimate advantage by saying, hey, we're going to have this huge loss leader in terms of a lot of employees, very big store, big land footprint. All of that's incredibly expensive. But we're going to dig ourselves in such a deep financial hole, we essentially have no competition because nobody else is going to look like we look. And from that, we'll kind of build a business on the other side of that loss leader. It's kind of a fascinating sort of business concept if you want to think about it that way. David Wayne Carroll says, if Ratledge starts at center versus Clemson, will we see Beck taking the snap more behind center or shotgun? Well, I'm very high on Jared Wilson on the basis that so many people close to the Georgia program are very high on Jared Wilson. It also seems like he's coming back from injury. So I do believe that Tate Ratledge is your backup center. But I believe that Jared Wilson is not only going to be healthy enough to start at center, I think that Georgia feels like it's got a very good center in Wilson, and you can't help but notice that. I was asked if I like the peach milkshakes from the fast food restaurant that's sort of famous for those. That's not my favorite thing. I'll eat the peach ice cream sandwich if I'm ever able to go to the Masters. You got to put it in your pocket, let it melt a little bit because it comes out so frozen. I'll eat the peach ice cream sandwich at the Masters if I'm ever lucky enough to go there. But a peach milkshake's not quite my favorite thing. Nick Roundtree says, I hate to derail the Bucky strain, but what's the perception of Dominic Lovett's impact this season? I think that Lovett's going to have a very big year for Georgia, assuming he stays healthy. And I think it's going to be, if I had to guess, a lot of that more so than just the sort of traditional slot role that you sort of expect Lovett to be in. I think this is a guy that has a chance to play outside a lot for Georgia and be just sort of a productive receiver, just sort of a general receiver, more than just the kind of slot specialist that he probably was during his time at Missouri. Shane Holiday says, stopping at Bucky's in Brunswick's going to add an hour to my Port Canaveral drive. Yes, Shane, I'm right there with you on that. Except for us, because we come down 75, we'll always stop at the one there at Fort Valley. So that's a big part of my pre-cruise tradition. You're absolutely right about that. Big part of that. Scott Harris also reminding us that Georgia is keeping a very long regular season win streak alive as it gets ready to play Clemson. That is true. Let's see what else. Gary Roach coaches at River Ridge High School saying, I hope to see one of our games. Love your show. Go Dogs. Gary, I really appreciate that. We'd love to be at River Ridge for a game there at some point in time. That would be a lot of fun. I would love to do that. We'll try to get to as many places as we can. So best of luck for you all in the upcoming season. And thank you so much for tuning in when you can to our show here today, Coach. I really appreciate that. Thank you. All right, we're going to get ready to go for now. All right. Marcellus Flute says, what's your favorite place to eat when you're on the road? So one of these days we'll get more into that. I know we've kind of talked about that some in the past, but we'll talk more about that. And because there's kind of two different things. You've got the breakfast food, and you got, sort of like the lunch dinner type deal. Late night, it's obviously always going to be Waffle House, and really do genuinely enjoy that. In fact, I stopped at Waffle House. But need to kind of get back into my sort of healthier ways here right now. I'm not quite on that wagon right now. So I did stop at Waffle House on the way home from the game on Saturday at Mercedes-Benz. Stopped by. Waffle House keep their stores so cold. And I'm very hot in nature, but they keep their stores so cold. Crazy how cold. I was shivering, but still eating my food on Saturday. So I love the late night stop at Waffle House. So we'll talk more about that in the future. For now, though, we're going to get ready to go. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them. on all of that. They'll get you tuned back up to factory fresh specs. It's still really, really hot, although I guess we're going to get a little bit of a break from that maybe the next couple of days. Either way, though, still want that air conditioning unit working the way that it's supposed to, and our friends at RS Andrews can make sure that's the case. So find them online at rsandrews.com. You have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.